In my last video, I introduced you to Fractal Thinking, a powerful 3-step framework for breaking down complex topics. But you probably walked away thinking, okay, that sounds great in theory, but how does it actually work in practice? Well, today we're going to find out. Have you ever looked at AI tool like ChatGPT and felt completely overwhelmed? Like you staring at some impossibly complex black box? Well, that's exactly what we're going to tackle today. I'm going to walk you through the fractal thinking process step by step using ChatGPT and Gemini as our real-world example, so you can see exactly how this framework transforms confusion into clarity. Now, before we dive into it, I want to clarify that the purpose of this video is to demonstrate how you can use the fractal thinking framework to approach learning about how AI tools like ChatGPT works. That is to help you come up with a plan to tackle this topic and not to teach you about how these AI tools work, because we won't be able to cover that in one video. However, once you have a strategy and a plan, it would make learning a lot easier, as you know exactly what you need to focus on to master this topic. Now, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's be honest about where most of us start when we try to understand how AI tools like ChatGPT or Gemini actually work. You're curious, so you start researching. You encounter terms like transformer architectures, attention mechanisms, and neural networks. You watch YouTube video that either treats you like a 5-year-old with oversimplified analogy, or assume you have a PhD in computer science. So you try again, and maybe you find a technical paper, but it's for mathematical equations that might as well be hieroglyphics. Or you stumble across a forum discussions where people are casually dropping terms like positioning encoding and multi-head attention, like everyone just know what those mean. Does that sound familiar to you? This isn't just an AI problem. This happens with any complex topic. Say, for example, try to understand blockchain, and you're drowning in cryptographic hashes, or want to learn about climate change, and suddenly you're supposed to understand atmospheric chemistry, or try quantum physics. Forget about it. So what do most of us do? We either give up entirely, or we pretend we understand when we really don't. We're not alone when someone mentions machine learning algorithms without actually grasping what's happening under the hood. And honestly, that's completely normal. The problem isn't you, it's how complex information is usually presented. Now, what if I told you that complex topics are not actually that complex? What if the real issue is that we're approaching them wrong? What if there's a way to make sense of any complicated subject, including cutting-edge AI, using a simple systematic approach? That's where fractal thinking comes in. Think of it as having a magnifying glass and a telescope at the same time. You can zoom in into the tiniest details while never losing sight of the big picture. Today, I'm going to walk you through this exact process. We're going to use ChatGPT and Gemini as our guinea pigs, and I'm going to show you step by step how fractal thinking transforms this seemingly impossible topic into something you can actually understand. And here's the best part. Once you see how this works, you have a framework that you can use for literally any complex topic. That blockchain technology you've been avoiding, or climate science, or even advanced marketing strategy, whatever it is, the same process will work. By the end of this video, you won't just have a plan of attack for learning how ChatGPT and Gemini work. You have a superpower for learning anything. Now, you're probably thinking, this sounds too good to be true. Maybe you've tried learning frameworks before and they didn't work. Maybe you're thinking, AI is genuinely complicated and there's no shortcut to understanding rocket science. And you know what? I get it. I felt exactly the same way. I used to think that some topics were just inherently too complex for regular people like me to understand. That you needed years of specialized education to make sense of advanced technology. And here's what changed my mind. I realized that complexity isn't about the topic itself. It's about how we approach it. Every complex system, no matter how sophisticated, is built from similar patterns. And once you know how to spot those patterns, everything else starts to make sense. Don't take my word for it. Let me show you exactly how it works and you can judge it for yourself. So think of fractal thinking as your learning mentor, a guide that helps you navigate any complex topic systematically. So here's the core idea. Just like a fractal pattern that repeats at every scale, think of a tree where each branch looks like a smaller version of the whole tree. Complex topics have patterns that repeat at every level of detail. The fractal thinking process has 3 steps. Step 1, identify the core pattern. This is like finding the trunk of the tree. Ask questions like, what is the fundamental idea that everything else builds on, to prompt your thinking process. Step 2, explore the components. Now we're going to examine the branches. We ask questions such as, what are the individual pieces that make up this pattern and how do they work? In step 3, reconnect to the whole. Finally, we step back and see the entire forest. How do all these pieces fit together to create a complete picture? This works because it mirrors how your brain naturally processes information. We understand new things by connecting them to patterns we already know, then building complexity layer by layer. Now, most learning approaches either start too simple or jump straight to expert level. Fractal thinkings, on the other hand, give you a path that scales with your understanding. All right, enough theory. Let's dive in. We're going to demystify ChatGPT and Gemini using the exact process. Right now, these tools probably seem like magic to you. You type something in and somehow they produce human-like responses. But by applying fractal thinking, we're going to break them down into completely understandable pieces. I want you to actually follow along with me, actively think through each step with me, because the goal here isn't just to learn about AI. It's to see how this framework works so you can use it for yourself. Now, are you ready? Let's start with step 1. Step 1 is finding the core pattern. Now, our goal is to understand how AI tools like ChatGPT and Gemini work, right? So where do we start? Well, if you dig into what ChatGPT and Gemini actually are, you discover they are both built on something called transformer-based language models. That's the technical term that describes the underlying technology powering these tools. So really understanding how ChatGPT and Gemini work comes down to understanding what a transformer-based language model is and how it functions. That will become our starting point. When faced with this term, transformer-based language model, what is the fundamental idea that everything else builds on? Let's use the first technique, break it down into smaller parts. I'm going to start with a hierarchy. To figure out the hierarchy for this, you prompt any generative AI, chatbots, ChatGPT, or Gemini to come up with a list of subtopics for any topic. So at the top level here, we have AI model. That's pretty broad. It just means a computer system that tries to mimic some aspect of intelligence. One level down, we get language model. This is more specific. It's an AI model that specifically works with human language. Another level down, we have transformer-based language model. This tells us how the language model works using something called a transformer architecture. Now you see how each level gets more specific, and we can trace the progression to give us our first clue about a core pattern. Now let's try the second technique, ask probing questions. What is a language model? Well, it's a system that understands and generates human language. But how does it do that? Well, it learns patterns from examples. What kind of patterns? Patterns about which words typically follow other words, what phrases mean in different contexts, and how language structures work. How does it use these patterns? Well, when you give it some text, it predicts what should come next based on everything else it has learned. Are you starting to see a pattern here? Now let's move on and try the third technique, analogies. Think of ChatGPT as a super intelligent autocomplete system. You know how your phone suggests the next word when you're texting? ChatGPT is similar, but it reads the entire internet and can predict not just the next word, but the entire paragraph, conversations, even creative stories. Think of it as a pattern recognition expert who has studied millions of books, articles, and conversations. When you ask it something, it's using all those patterns it has learned to generate a response that fits the context. So what's our core pattern? Well, here it is. It's predictive text generation based on learned patterns. That's it. Everything else, transformers, attention mechanism, training dataset, all of that is just different mechanisms to enable the implementation of this basic core pattern. The model learns pattern from text, then uses those patterns to predict what comes next. This might seem too simple, but that's the point. Once you have the core pattern, everything else becomes much easier to understand. Now, let's zoom in on the pieces that make this pattern work. This is where we examine how predictive text generation actually happens under the hood. So this is step 2. Let's explore the key components. First, transformer. This is the architecture that processes input and generates output. Think of it like the engine of a car. You don't need to know every detail of how an engine works to understand that it converts fuel into motion. Similarly, transformer convert input text into prediction about what should come next. The transformer names come from how it transforms information from one form to another. Next, attention mechanism. This is how models decide what's important in the input. Imagine you in a crowded restaurant trying to have a conversation. Your brain automatically focuses on your friend's voice while filtering out the background noise. Attention mechanism works the same way. They help the model focus on the most relevant parts of the input text when making predictions. Moving on to tokenization. Before the model can predict text, it needs to break it into smaller pieces called tokens. Think of it like cutting a sandwich into bite-sized pieces so you can eat it. The model can't process the entire sentence at once, so it breaks them down into manageable chunks, sometimes words, sometimes parts of the words. Next, training. This is how the model learns those patterns in the first place. Imagine speed reading millions of books, articles, and websites, and developing an incredibly sophisticated sense of how language works. That's essentially what happens during training. The model sees billions of examples of text and gradually learns to predict what comes next. To put it into perspective, an average person can read between 500 to 2,000 books in their entire lifetime. So we're talking about tons of data and training happening here. Lastly, fine-tuning. After the basic training, the model gets specialized for specific tasks. Think of it like training a general athlete for a specific sport. The basic fitness is there, but now you are developing specialized skill. ChatGPT, for example, is fine-tuned to be helpful, harmless, and honest in conversations. Here's what's fascinating. Have you noticed how each component follows the same basics as the whole system? Tokenization takes input and predicts how to break it down. Attention takes input and predicts what's important. Training takes example and predicts patterns. So each piece is doing its own version of input, processing, prediction. That's the fractal nature at work. The same pattern repeat at different scales. So far we learned about transformer and attention and training, but how does it all fit together? This is where most people get lost in the details. We learned about transformer and attention and training, but how does it all fit together? Can we still see the forest for the trees? So let's step back and reconnect everything to our core pattern. Predictive text generation based on learned pattern. So picture this process. You type questions into ChatGPT. First, tokenization breaks your text into digestible pieces. Then the transformer processes these tokens using attention mechanisms to figure out what parts of your question are most important for generating a good response. Based on all the patterns learned during training, the model then predicts what the first word of a good response should be. Then it predicts the second word, considering both your question and the first word it generated. Then the third word, considering everything that came before that, and so on, building up a complete response one prediction at a time. So you see how the core patterns repeats here. The whole system predicts text, but it does this by having each component predicts its own output. Tokenization predicts word boundary. Attention predicts relevance. And the transformer predicts the next token. Each level mirrors the overall function. Now let's think about this in layers, like looking at a fractal at different zoom levels. The first iteration, which we can consider basic understanding. The system learns patterns from text and uses them to predict responses. This is like seeing the overall shape of our fractal. And moving on to the second iteration, which I consider mechanical understanding. We zoom in and see how this actually works through transformer, attention, and tokenization working together. This is like seeing the main branches of our fractal trees. Third iteration, deeper understanding. We could zoom in further to understand the mathematics, the neural network's weights, the specific training algorithms. Each level reveals more intricate detail while maintaining the same underlying pattern. The beautiful thing is that you don't need to understand every level to grasp how the system works. You can stop at whatever level of detail serves your purpose. So do you see it? That moment when the pieces click together and you realize it's not magic at all. It's an elegant system built on a simple yet powerful pattern, repeated at multiple scale. So look what just happened here. In less than 10 minutes, you went from AI is a mysterious black box to understanding the fundamental mechanic of how ChatGPT and Gemini works. Think about what you now know. You understand how ChatGPT generates responses, is predicting the most likely next word based on patterns learned from massive amount of text. You now know why it sometimes makes mistakes. It's because it's working with probabilities and patterns, not perfect knowledge. Sometimes the most likely next word isn't the correct one. You get why training on huge data sets is so important. The more patterns you see, the better its prediction become. You understand why context matters so much. In your prompt, the model used everything you said to predict what should come next. And here is the best part. You achieve this understanding not by memorizing technical jargon, but by following a systematic process that revealed the underlying logic. So that aha moment you just had, that feeling of clarity where something complex becomes simple, that's the power of fractal thinking in action. Of course, we're only scratching the surface here, but at least now you have a map that guides you wherever you want to go and dig deeper. So let's put this into test, this understanding, to make sure it's really solid. Can you explain why ChatGPT sometimes gives different answers to the same questions? Pause this video and see if you can come up with the answer on your own and comment it below. If you said something like because it's predicting the most probable next word and there might be multiple good options, especially if you ask in a slightly different way, then you got it. Why do this model need so much training data? Well, because the more example of language patterns they see, the better they get at predicting what should come next in new situations. How are ChatGPT and Gemini similar, and how might they differ? Well, they use both the same core patterns, which is predictive text generation based on learned patterns, but they might be trained on different data set, use slightly different architectures, or be fine-tuned for different purposes. So you see how you're not just reciting facts, you're understanding the underlying logic. You can reason about how these systems work because you grasp the fundamental patterns. This understanding connects to so much more too. The same basic patterns, like learning from example to make prediction, shows up throughout AI. Image recognition model, for example, predicts what objects are in the pictures. Recommendation system predicts what you might want to watch next. It's the same fractal pattern, just applied to different types of data. And this proves something very important. You're no longer intimidated by complexity. You have a systematic approach to break down any complex topic. The framework scales with your curiosity and your needs. You now have a superpowers for learning. This fractal thinking framework works for any complex topic you want to tackle. Want to understand advanced marketing strategy? Step 1, find a core pattern. Step 2, explore the components. And step 3, see how they connect. Curious about climate science? Same process. Or trying to grasp a new technology in your field? Same process. The framework adapts to whatever you're curious about. But here's what I really want for you to do. Share this approach. When you see someone struggling with a complex topic, help them break it down using these 3 steps. Teach them to find the core pattern first, then explore the components, then reconnect to the whole. Because once you've experienced that moment of clarity, when complexity becomes simple, you realize that almost nothing is actually as complicated as it first appears. It's just patterns you haven't recognized yet. So here's my challenge for you. What's one complex topic have you been avoiding because it seemed too difficult? Something you've always wanted to understand but never felt smart enough to tackle. Drop it in the comments below. I bet you'll be surprised how quickly you can make progress using fractal thinking. And if you want to see more videos on making the complex simple, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell, because there's always another challenging topic to demystify. And now you have the tool to tackle any of them. Now remember, complexities is just patterns you haven't recognized yet. With fractal thinkings, every impossible topic becomes just another puzzle to solve. What will you tackle next?